Well, welcome. I'd like to welcome all of you to Marquette University in this wonderful Eckstein Hall for a special On the Issues with Dr. Michael Berenbaum. We're very pleased to have Dr. Berenbaum here to talk about the Holocaust, but I also want to make sure we thank Marianne Lubar, who helped make this event happen. She brought Dr. Berenbaum here to a visit to Jewish Museum Milwaukee, and reached out to us and asked if we'd be willing to host and On the Issues, and we very graciously said yes, and we're honored that you even asked us, Marianne, so thank you for that. So as it turns out, I was just here 2 short days ago, and I happened to be sitting in Dr. Berenbaum's shoes. But I will say that for those of you who know Mike Goucher, he's just a consummate professional. And as I sat in Dr. Berenbaum's chair and answered questions from Mike, it was almost like I was just having a conversation one-on-one with him without even the crowd being here. And it just seemed so natural. So we really thank you, Mike, for your contributions to Marquette and really to the city. And Dr. Berenbaum, we certainly are very proud to have you here. He received his PhD in religion and culture in 1975 from Florida State University. In American Jewish University, Los Angeles, he's director of the Siggy Zuring Institute and a professor of Jewish studies. President Carter named him the President's Commission on the Holocaust back in 1979, and he spent a decade as a project director at the National Holocaust Museum. He's a writer, lecturer, teacher, and author of 21 books, scores of scholarly articles, and hundreds of journalistic pieces. He served as a historic consultant, producer, and other roles in films and documentaries for the History Channel, HBO, NBC, and PBS, and arguably is the most notable scholar on the Holocaust in the United States. Now, Marquette hosts On the Issues for many reasons, but I think the most important one is really because the law school in Marquette wants to be a thought leader, not only for Milwaukee, but in society in general. Now, earlier this year, as an example, the Anti-Defamation League released the results of a worldwide survey of more than 53,000 people in more than 100 countries. And worldwide, only 54% of those surveys had ever even heard of the Holocaust. And the same individuals of those who had heard of it, 1/3 of them believed that the Holocaust was a myth or greatly exaggerated. And so these results really bring to mind a passage from Deuteronomy about the responsibility of memory that coincidentally is displayed in the Hall of Remembrance in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And it reads, "Only guard yourself and guard your soul carefully, lest you forget the things your eyes saw, and lest these things depart your heart all the days of your life. And you shall make them known to your children and to your children's children." So Dr. Berenbaum, we are so proud to have you here to help us remember the Holocaust.
Thank you, Dr. Lovell, and thanks to all of you for joining us at this special time for On the Issues. We're delighted to have Michael Berenbaum with us today. Doctor, I know you spoke earlier today, and I'm going to begin with a question that I guess is appropriate for the day, 9/11. And as someone who has spent his life studying, I guess we could call it absolute evil, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this day, the day of the World Trade Center attacks anniversary.
I have 4 thoughts on it. The first is I recall where I was on 9/11. I think for a couple of generations, there will be those of us who have certain days we'll never forget. Those of us who are old enough to remember November 22nd, 1963, will know forever where they were precisely on that day. I was on an airplane about to take off to Washington. And I carried, this was before cell phones were easy, I carried, among other things, a beeper. My beeper went off 35 times. And finally, in frustration, I called my wife from the airplane. I thought there had been a family emergency. And she said, "Get off the plane." Didn't tell me what happened, but get off the plane. And she said, "Stop." And the pilot essentially said, "I don't think we're going to be taking off. We're going to come back to base, to the gate. And essentially, I would suggest you get your luggage and plan your day accordingly." We came back. We were taken to a hangar because the police didn't know how many planes were going to attack Washington, D.C., and therefore they checked us on the way off the plane, including our luggage. Let me say our second thing is, and I spoke a little bit about this today, I was involved with the people who were involved in the creation of the 911 Museum. And we face as a nation the reality that the legacy of 911 is not yet established. And they had a problem, and the problem in creating a museum is what is its conclusion. And since the story is unfolding, you don't have the conclusion. The memorial is able to do something very interesting. It's able to deal with what we deal with, which is what I call the presence of absence and the absence of presence. Presence of absence is that, look at the memorial, it's on the footprint of the original Twin Towers, and there's a depth of water and the names of the people who lost their life there. And years ago, we used to have from New York, the absence of presence were the two intersecting lights that said, here once stood a tower, and it is no longer, and all you have is the void at the core. What's the legacy? We have to go back to last night. If you were to go to the George W. Bush Library, the legacy was, we're now in a war against terrorism, Afghanistan, Iraq, and leaves it off really with the surge. If the legacy really is one, there is evil in this world, for us we have to recognize that it's a religiously based evil, based on the type of religion that regards the other as infidel to be destroyed, including the secular other, us who have American values. And it's a religiously based type of fanatical legacy, which is the evil. And how we're going to deal with it and how we're going to live in its presence is still unfolding. And I thought that last night the president began to understand that dealing with such evil means you have to go against every one of your basic instincts. And that's a frightening thing for us as a nation. And the other is that we have to demand something else than, one of the problems in which we as a nation dealt with 911 was that there was no ought that came out of it. When we deal with the legacy of the Holocaust, we always try to say there's an ought that has to come out of it, a commandment, an injunction. There was no real ought, and the first articulation of the ought, go shopping, keep up with your life, and all of that stuff is not a significant enough ought. Part of it has to be that we had the second legacy of 911, which was the New York coming together. It means that we have to look about how do we encounter the other in a different way so we don't replicate the type of evil forces that are bent at us. But I can tell you that evil exists in this world. It exists in many forms. And let me make a Holocaust point. Everybody talks about Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil. Hannah Arendt was so philosophically wrong. It's not the banality of evil. The evil was absolute. It was anything but banal. It was extraordinary. It was demonic. The evil maker may have been banal. Eichmann may have been an ordinary man. What he perpetrated at that point and what these guys perpetrated at that point, something deeper. And the last thing we could call these people, and this is what we don't know how to deal with, you can't call them cowards. Because people who are willing to die are not, by our definitions, cowards. There may be many things, but they're not that. And therefore, we're dealing with an evil that has an absolute character to it. And, I said to you a while ago, my dream is that I someday deal with an event that is thoroughly and completely and totally irrelevant, because we live in a world that says, look what 20th century humanity did to another. But that's not the world that you and I dwell in.
Well, let's talk about your life's work. When did you know that the telling the story of the Holocaust would be your life's work? What was the determining factor in that for you?
Well, it's a wonderful question because you got to understand my background. I grew up in the post-war era. My parents were American. My parents were the children of immigrants for whom the American experience was absolutely basic. My mother changed her first name about 3 or 4 times until she came up with the name Rhea, and my father was even contemplating at one time whether he was going to change his name to Americanizing it and all of that. They were, my grandparents spoke Yiddish, and they spoke Yiddish to each other and to their children who answered them in English and the like. But I grew up in a time, I went to Hebrew-speaking day schools. And to give you an idea of in my generation, the content of Zionism was the Hebrew language. So when I first went to Israel, this is how I asked for directions in Shakespearean Hebrew. If your heart inclineth in my direction, would you kindly indicate to me, thy humble servant, what is the proper anointed path upon which one should tread to reach the following destination? They had me repeat that to the entire bus on the loudspeaker, and everybody laughed at me, but that's the way in which I learned the King's Hebrew. I also grew up in a synagogue that was comprised of German Jewish immigrants, German and Belgian Jewish immigrants, all of whom had done very well for themselves, not only in the United States, but before they were all diamond merchants, which meant that they had portable wealth, and when they had to flee, they could take resources with them, unlike people in real estate or unlike lawyers who are dependent on language and on law systems. And we were the Americans, and what I had gotten subliminally, and I'll tell you how I got there, was that we were to try to make up for, we were the guys raised on sour cream and whipped cream and all the glories of America, and, you know, America of affluence, America of new horizons, and we were to make up for a world that was destroyed. So I became interested in school, in undergraduate and graduate school, in a very interesting question, which I've been trying to answer, which is, why didn't the Jews go out of business after defeat? And I was asking that in 586 and 70 of the Common Era, when a guy came up to me and said, you're not asking an ancient question, you're asking a modern question. I'm asking a modern question. I've learned 9 different ancient languages to be able to understand this. I'm going out of my mind with stuff like Ugaritic and Aramaic and all of this stuff. Don't give me this modern stuff. Give me some Holocaust literature. And I realized really deeply that this was the question I was trying to answer. Flash forward a little bit. So I did my doctorate on the Holocaust. And then it turned out by all sorts of fortuitous accidents that my task in life has been to introduce in an American idiom what was communicated to me in silence. So the museum was to take the parochial interests of a bereaved community, to say that they were of such moral importance that they could speak to the American nation from the shadow of the National Mall, and speak to character and morality and against racism and bigotry and the like. And then after I did that, I had an early midlife crisis, which is I had the opportunity in 1988 through 1993 to spend $190 million putting my ideas into a building form, an incredible thing. You don't get that opportunity very often, especially when it's not your own $190 million. So I then said, and one day, and you'll appreciate this if you work in administration, one day I was sitting after 4 or 5 days of budget meetings, which ended, and I said, I'm going upstairs to work. And a woman colleague of mine put her arms around me and said, you don't understand something. I said, what don't I understand? You have been working. You're now in the position where your control of the institution is not by ideas, but it's by budgets. And I said, have mercy on the institution. And she said, you're going upstairs to play. You're going to think, you're going to write, you're going to dream, you're going to do this. So I said, well, it's less fun to manage an institution than it is to create one. Then I was lucky a second time in my life, and Spielberg came along and said, why don't you try this crazy project of taking, he had promised 50,000 testimonies. We ended up doing 52,000 testimonies in 32 languages in 57 countries. Of survivors, telling their story, and an opportunity really to make them put into words before they left this earth what they could not communicate to me. Last biographical story, I had a really close friend whom I wanted to come to summer camp with me. So I tell him, I want you to come to camp with me. He goes home, he says, Michael wants me to come to Lager. Lager is the German word which meant concentration camp. He spoke Yiddish English to his parents, did not think they would understand the word camp. So the father calls my father with tears in his eyes, screaming, nobody's going to take my kid to Lager. My father knows enough to understand. He says, let's take a ride Sunday morning. We go up to camp. It's got swimming pools, lakes, and bunks, and tennis courts, and baseball fields. And my father explains to him that this is how kids in the United States, we lived in New York before the era where air conditioning was commonplace. This is the way kids spend their summer. And, there are things like girls there, and we can get away with not saying women. They're 14, 13 years old. And, your son is going to have a wonderful experience. But his translation of my experience was Lager. And then we understood that it wasn't yet put into words. My job became in life to put it into words and to create and shape new forms. And I'm not the child of survivors, and I'm the child of Americans. And therefore, for me, the transition to an American language was to give voice to what was communicated to me in silence.
So a couple questions based on what you've done, which is important and pretty amazing. I mean, whether it's the creation of the Holocaust Memorial Museum or whether it is taking testimony from tens of thousands of survivors, does it bother you when you hear the kind of numbers that Dr. Lovell recited, that there are many people in this world who do not understand the story of the Holocaust or do not understand it correctly? Does that bother you at this point in your life? Is that what keeps you motivated? Is that what keeps you driven?
No, the opposite keeps me driven. Let me tell you a wonderful story. I was invited to Rwanda. I was invited to Rwanda right after the genocide when it was exceedingly fresh. When the issue was, how do you document a genocide so it can't be denied, which in Rwanda at that point was, how do you bury the dead? And we showed them how to create photographic evidence and markers and all of this stuff, so that you could have within a community where death occurred, murder occurred in churches, in the middle of town, and all of that, and you had the dead lying around still, and you had to bury them before disease. And for law students or law school, they also had something. They wanted to bring everybody who was a perpetrator to trial, which would have meant tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands at that point. We at Nuremberg tried, a symbolic number to replace the scaffolding of civilization. I love to walk a city. The way you learn a city is to walk it. Walk out one night in Kigali, and I come to a place which is eerily quiet. There is not a cat, there's not a dog, there's not a sound of a car moving, a door slamming, people talking. And I said, danger is a cultural phenomenon. If you don't know where you are culturally, you don't know what danger is. I may be in a no man's land because nobody's alive here, nothing's happening here. And it wasn't that late at night, so I did the only honorable thing a man can do at that point is I turned around and jogged home. Walk into the hotel, sweaty as hell, and a young, rather attractive blonde woman walks up and hugs me. Doesn't happen to me often. Doesn't happen to me often enough. She turns to me and she says, because of you, I stayed. 3 things then become clear. She'd been a student of mine at Georgetown. She'd been a student of mine in Georgetown in 1984, which was 10 years before. And we had had a phenomenal class at that point, which had nothing to do with me. I had made it the business, I was beginning to work on oral testimony, made the business of my students to take one testimony, listen to it, video testimony, listen to it, and adopt that person for the course. So anytime our experience went with theirs, the experience of their survivor, they would come in. 4 or 5 weeks into the semester, a young woman comes into my office and says, can I tell my story? I, like a dum-dum, say, and what's your story? She was a survivor of Cambodia. She had experienced genocide herself. She was this Asian woman sitting in class. So I said, of course you can tell your story. And she proceeded for 4 weeks to tell her story and to invite her parents, her mother actually, who was the only survivor, to come in and tell her story as well. And out went the curriculum and the syllabus, but in came an education. 10 years go forward, this young woman who greets me becomes a doctor, joined Doctors Without Borders. The genocide begins. The American Marines come in not to end the genocide, but to get the Americans out. And she says, the only moral thing I can do now is to stay. Turns to me, she says, you got to do me a favor. And what comes to me is a biblical image, half of my kingdom, it's yours, anything you want. She says, you got to go meet my parents and tell them why I stayed, because they're not talking to me anymore. They'll, hear that I'm alive and hang up the phone, you should come home. That's one thing. You take a look then also at Samantha Powers, who's our UN ambassador. She wrote a book called The Problem from Hell, Genocide, America in the Age of Genocide. Shaped by the Holocaust and by other genocides, she's now at the center of American national policy, yelling for a response to genocide. I'm going tomorrow to speak to at 100th anniversary of Jan Karski's birth, my colleague at Georgetown. And he was the man who brought the word of what was happening in Europe to America, met with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was what we call a messenger. So what energizes me is not what people don't know, but the type of transformation that can really take place if you understand what this is, if you internalize it, and then if you become crystal clear and committed to the type of oughts, the type of commandments, the type of responsibilities that come from learning this history. I can go in for hours into the methodological mistakes of the ADL survey, but I'm not going to do that unless the audience later asks it. But no serious social scientist takes part of their survey seriously. And I say that with love for ADL and the like. And the reason is because they ask the same questions over 60 years to get a longitudinal study without understanding that Jews and their situation in the world had changed over 60 years. We'll leave it at that, and you'll ask about it later.
Well, let me ask you this. I think you've said that this is one of the challenges, that as you continue to tell this story, is that we're moving from, I think you referred to it as the living moment to a historical event. Does that change the meaning of the Holocaust?
Absolutely. We're going from living memory to historical memory. Living memory was the embodiment of people who said, I was there. I had a conversation with this gentleman not more than a half an hour ago. Mr. Appel, he tells me that he was speaking one day before a synagogue meeting in which they asked him about his trip, and he spoke about his trip to Mauthausen. And then after he was finished, a survivor came up and said to him, you know, I was in Mauthausen. And all of a sudden he realized, and I'm not misspeaking, he realized the audacity of what it meant for him to speak about visiting the camp versus someone who was actually there. We are about to lose the last survivors. The last survivors will be children's survivors, many of whom, not children of survivors, but children's survivors, some of whom have a little, and I'm going to say it impolitely, have a chip on their shoulder because some of them had parents who denied what they could remember. Kids don't remember things in precisely the same way, but they remember danger, they remember abandonment, they remember a whole range of things. And for many years, the adult survivors didn't take what their kids remembered seriously. Now they're the last to remember. Now the question becomes whether we're going to lose the authority of survivors. We're going to also lose one other thing. We're going to lose the survivor as symbol of resilience and the idea that you can face the worst in life and come back. And survivors, in essence, not only faced the worst in life and came back, but in our generation, and we've seen it over the last 20 years, they transformed themselves visually from victim to witness, to having the moral credibility to make demands of us in society. Now, what's going to happen when that's not there? Part of our work, part of Spielberg's, great contribution was that we're going to be able to prolong the encounter with survivors and the rest of us for generations because we have all this technology. Let me give you a vivid example. Suppose that this technology had existed in the time of Jesus. If you're a believing Christian, we're in a Jesuit university, which is even arguably a Roman Catholic university. I taught at Georgetown, so I have the right to say that. But if you're taking it seriously, imagine if we were able to have on tape not only the recollections of 4 people who lived afterwards who told the narrative. Look, Jewish and Christian theology is based on story. The Bible or Book of Commandments would begin the 12th chapter of Exodus, not with in the beginning when God began to create. Suppose we had that and we heard from everybody who had been touched by his life. How rich then would your ability to encounter the event be? Be extraordinary. Suppose that we had, those of us who are Jewish, we had the Passover Seder and we were able to hear from somebody who was actually a slave and who actually went through that and went into the desert. How rich would that testimony be? We have now available to us not only, and history is usually written by elites. History is written by elites. It's written by people who know, who have kept diaries, who have written letters, who write documents. This is from Joe the baker, from Chaya the seamstress, from people from professors to cobblers, all of whom lived through an extraordinary event. We saw yesterday at this exhibit at the Jewish Museum in Milwaukee the desperation of one woman who wanted to rebuild her future by having a mobile profession. She was a designer, and she offered to show that she could be employed 8 design of dresses, which they made here in Milwaukee. And again, we now can tell that in narrative, in story, have that available to us and accessible to us. So we'll prolong it, but we're going to lose something very serious. I hope we don't lose the soul. And I have a major complaint in life generally, and leadership in particular, is we're moving from the generation of charismatic leaders to managerial leaders. Right? We go from, even in certain professions, you go from people in, let's say, the auto industry who lived, breathed, died, with automobiles, to a guy who looks at figures at his desk. And I don't want to lose that moral authority with regard to survivors, but we're in a transition period, and nobody knows, I least of all, what's going to happen. I'll tell you a funny story. I had a business school person who came to me, wanted to do a wonderful thesis. She said, I learned in business school that if you can anticipate a problem, you can take steps to solve it. Everybody in the field of Holocaust studies knows that the survivors are not going to be there. Let me interview everybody and see what steps they're taking to solve that problem. I said, gee, I never thought of that. Terrific, go. I'll serve on your committee. I gave her introductions to everybody. Comes back 6 months later, and she says, well, I had a wonderful experience, but I have no thesis. What's my no thesis? She says, everybody knows there's a problem, and nobody has figured out what to do about it. So I said, well, your thesis is to figure out something to do about it.
Tell me about the role of universities in helping teach about the story of the Holocaust. Universities like this one, you talked about your Georgetown experience. What is the responsibility of academic institutions in helping us better understand this history?
The first responsibility of academic institutions is to remember in a very deep way that the perpetrators were educated people who were graduates of universities. There was a meeting on January 20th, 1942 of 15 men, and I'm being gender specific, in which they considered what to do about the Jewish question. The meeting was called the Wannsee Conference. Around the table were the number 2 men in each of the representative party, government, and military institutions. 8 of them had doctorates. 8 of them had doctorates. All of them were university graduates. They were what we of the Vietnam generation would call the best and the brightest. And they weren't there to make a decision. They were there to do something else. They were there to be complicitous in a decision that had been previously made. They were there essentially so once they left the meeting, they understood that the SS was in charge, that they were to cooperate. They knew what was about to happen. Consequences of that meeting were when they met, 4 out of 5 Jews who were to die in the Holocaust were still alive. 15 months later, 4 out of 5 of the Jews were dead. They were desk killers. They did nothing heavier than lift up a pen. But they created the institutions that led to death and destruction. They were all the best that universities have to offer. Doctorates, law degrees, all of this stuff. Lawyers, they were 7. There were 7 lawyers around the table who never asked about the goal, but never asked about the end result, but about the task and the instrumentality. Greatest philosopher of the 20th century by many accounts was Martin Heidegger, who was a Nazi, blessed the regime that was taking forward, was not an anti-Semite because he had personal relations with the greatest of his students, Hannah Arendt, with whom he had been intimate. So he didn't buy into the racial theory, didn't even buy into the intellectual theory, but blessed this thing. So the university was complicitous. So I want to make sure that I don't educate monsters. And frankly, when I taught at Georgetown, and I was very scared that there was going to be, Georgetown has a great school of international studies, which has among its people men and now women who are going to be princes and prime ministers and presidents of future governments. And I was always frightened that there was a guy in the back of the room who was going to say, now what did they do wrong? And what can I do better? So I believe that our responsibility is, one, to inform, and two, I believe that our second responsibility is to make sure that we do not create educated monsters who have all the skills and the abilities of modern men and women, all the genius of modern technology, all the capacity for creative thought, and no moral core. And that's one of the reasons that I enjoy teaching at religious institutions that at least believe, or even though they're technically secular, that have a religious core that really believe they want to change the person and enhance their character, their dignity, their decency, and everything else, rather than merely have a technological function. So that's the responsibility of the university. And let me say the great responsibility, and I'm mindful of the fact that I'm a Catholic Jesuit institution, the great responsibility of the church is the responsibility of all religions today, and the Roman Catholic Church is the best example of that, which is to find a way within our own religious traditions to treat the other not as demonic and as an infidel, but the other as a brother or a fellow creature created in the image of God. John the 23rd and John Paul II, the two newest saints in the Roman Catholic Church, instituted a revolution in Roman Catholicism that changed the teaching of the church over 2,000 years, embracing the Jews rather than regarding them as the other. They did so because they took the ingredients of their own religious faith and saying, with the consequences of what was happening in mind, they said, we got to do better. And believe me that this, going back to 9/11, the greatest religious question today that may determine the fate of the world is whether we can have a voice in radical Islam that finds a tradition within radical Islam, and there is a tradition there, and that tradition would be to treat Jews and Christians at least as people of the book and as people of the Abrahamic faith, rather than treat them as infidels who are to be eliminated, exterminated, converted, or whatever have you. Islam has the tradition. And if you had asked me historically, and I say this as a historian, as a Jew, any time but in the last 60 years, if I had the choice of living under Islamic domination or Christian domination, I would choose not to live under anybody's domination. This is the great genius of America, and I am a proud, patriotic American. But I would choose to live under nobody's domination. But if I had a choice between a Muslim or a Christian domination, I would choose Muslim domination because they had respect for the book and treated the Jews as people of the book, as they did Christians, and we have to recover that tradition. So I'm anxious to see the pride, the fanaticism, the deep passion come in the language of moderation.
Are you worried, as some are, some of the Jewish community are worried that we are seeing a surge in anti-Semitism in Europe, other places around this world? There is a deep concern on the part of some. Do you share that concern?
Yes, no, and maybe. But let me explain. Sure. I'm going to give it to you very briefly because I spoke a little bit about that in the morning. What we have in, number one, there's an anti-Semitic panic within the Jewish community that's unwarranted by all of the dimensions of it. Let me explain that in 1 second. And by the way, there used to be a famous joke. What was a Jewish telegram? Start worrying, letter to follow. Now, we may have to explain to our younger students what a telegram is, but that's something else. So when I say there was an anti-Semitic panic, I don't mean, God forbid, God willing, but not God forbid, to deny that there's anti-Semitism. Let me give it to you in about 1 minute. There is anti-Semitism that is of Europe, but not, that is in Europe, but not of Europe. Meaning, if you adapt the values of Europe, you have learned to live with the Jews as a natural, normal part of the country. It is in Europe, but not of Europe. That's in a population that is non-assimilated and responds to events in the Middle East. They have joined forces with the left, which has joined in being, let's put it most positively, not enamored with Israel, but being vigorously anti-Israel. What's the advantage in that? There's two crazy advantages happening in Europe today. Number one is they can't join forces with the other anti-Semitic element in Europe, which is the radical right, because the radical right is also anti-immigrant. So what would have naturally been something that could have joined the extremes cannot join the extremes, because one element of that is deeply opposed to immigrants, and so deeply opposed to immigrants that they don't want to enter into that discourse. All of Europe is shocked by the parliamentary elections that brought radical right to greater prominence in the European Union. What's the second thing that stops it is the second thing that limits it is that government officials now have spoken out against anti-Semitism. Strongly, powerfully, and the like. They've spoken out against anti-Semitism because they really don't want that to characterize their nation. Not because they're moral, virtuous, terrific people, but because their own self-interest is that the nation not become like that, but maintain that thrust of European values. Third element is that, again, gets me from the thrust of it, and then I'll give you the last. Third element is in 73 and 79, the war situation increased the price of oil tenfold. And then we had oil shortages. And believe me, a population, you remember, some of you, population that can't fill up its cars gets very angry, very worried, and the like, and that is an ingredient. And also, if we were to increase your oil prices by tenfold, most of us would be economically hard-pressed, even those of us who are reasonably privileged. Oil has gone down from $103 a barrel to $91 a barrel during all of this. The market has reached all-time highs. So you have an ingredient, and oil going down is an international global market, and that means you have an ingredient that doesn't make the economic dislocation part and parcel of the war situation. Last point, which is not a good point, is I am uncertain, if I were to go through this as a social scientist, that one could say that there is an actual increase in anti-Semitism, but rather an increase in the freedom to express anti-Semitism, as there is an increase in the freedom to express hatred throughout our globe, and the ability through internet and social media and communication to have a community that shares your values. I use values in quotation marks. That shares your values, shares your animus. So I believe that it is more the fact that we live in a society that hates, in a world in which hatred can be expressed and find a community of hatred, rather than it's, tell you a story which In the mid to late 70s, I had an African-American colleague who was wonderful. We both worked for a horrific boss. He came out of a meeting and he said, "That son of a bitch racist bastard." And I put my arm around him and I said, "Archie, let me suggest something to you, that if you said son of a bitch bastard, you would be describing him sufficiently." I said, "Sit here and let's look for a little while and let's see how other people come out." A week goes by, he comes to my office, he closes the door. He said, "I thought it was all about me. The guy is just plain a bastard." He said, "But I've never experienced a white who's a universal bastard without it being particular to me." This was the first time, we dealt in a universally a bastard. So sometimes hatred is expressed, and hatred becomes a prevalent phenomenon, and Jews think of it in terms of anti-Semitism without considering the general culture which allows hatred. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about hatred. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about anti-Semitism, but that's the general characteristic of the entire society.
Let me stop there and take a couple questions from the audience. If you're in the seating bowl, this area down here, put your finger down on the rim, not on the ball, on the rim. Hold it there, and we'll be able to hear your question. If you're in the back and you have a question, just raise your hand, and Ryan, the gentleman over there to my left, will run over to you and give you a microphone to speak into so that we can all hear you. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll go from there. Any questions from the audience? We'll start here, and we'll get up to you in a moment. Yes, sir.
Michael, hold it down.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
Michael, you commented on the role of the university. Extend it to education in general. Where is it and how is it that the moral imperatives that come out of the Holocaust need to be conveyed across age and gender lines?
That's a terrific question. Let me say that we did an interesting survey 25 years ago of the impact of Holocaust education. And what we found in the survey was something interesting. Teachers said they weren't doing anything different, but three phenomena were observable, which is that the librarians reported that people were making use of the library. That's in the old days when they really had libraries. That people were making use of the libraries and they were really doing other work. We also found something very interesting, and this resulted from two things. It resulted, number one, from sometimes that there were complaints from parents to what their kids were studying, but also parents saying that all of a sudden kids were coming home and asking questions of them and of their grandparents who were alive during the war. Now, I've been the father of 4 teenagers. You ask the kid, "How was school today?" "Yeah." "What'd you do in school?" "Well, none," and the like. But the idea that your kid comes home at the end of the day and wants to sit down and discuss an issue that they studied in class, astounding. And the idea that they were asking their grandparents questions, "Where were you? What were you doing?" and the like, and "What was it like?" Or they're asking their parents that. This was real learning. And teachers reported something else. They reported that Holocaust education allowed people to discuss issues that were not discussed during class. Issues about race, issues about power, issues about bullying, issues about discrimination, issues about picking on people and how people were different. It became an essential part of moral education, far enough from the American shore to allow us to raise issues in a context that was relatively safe and not dividing. And in Europe, it's becoming essential to the education for democracy. Europe is teaching the Holocaust to teach the necessity for pluralism, tolerance, and democracy. And it's remarkable that that's what they're using because the Holocaust has come to be in the world today, and denial is, we'll talk about that in 10 seconds. Holocaust has come to be in the world today. We don't know what's evil, but the one thing that we know for sure is that this is evil. It's what I can term conceptually the negative absolute. And consequently, it says we don't want to go in that direction. Now, how do you do that with denial? The reality, first of all, a story. If you want to understand the madness of this world, let's deal 2 years ago. Understand this. The president of Germany and the chancellor of Germany go with the president of the United States to Buchenwald, guided by Elie Wiesel. And the president of Iran, country that saved Jews, that rescued Jews, where no Jew was injured in the Holocaust, denies that it happened. You want the craziness of the world? Who should deny the Holocaust? The perpetrators. And what should the president of Iran be doing? The president of Iran should be saying, that shows the vacuousness and the degenerate status of the West. We live in a world so opposite. Now, why is he denying the Holocaust? A, because it's a wish fulfillment, which is if you say Israel's the outgrowth of the Holocaust, no Israel. Secondly, it was becoming the enfant terrible, the terrible child who gets attention by that because we pay dramatic attention. But some people want to deny the Holocaust because they don't want to face its consequences. You know, we sometimes do a shallow thing. We love Anne Frank because she says, in the end, I believe that man is good at heart. Man may be good at heart. The Holocaust is no evidence for it. 9/11 is no evidence for it. ISIL is no evidence for it. You want to contend that man is good at heart? Give me other evidence, not this event. You got to face that darkness. You got to deal with that thing. Only an honorable person a person who seeks honor, understanding, and wisdom faces the negative reality. So that's the important point of what happens. Holocaust education becomes character education, becomes historical education, becomes a way for kids to consider a whole range of things that don't normally get raised in the classroom, as well as history. It also may occasionally force kids to look at maps, which GPS has now destroyed as a sense, because you only know that you're going from point A to point B. You don't see anything that comes in between. Other questions?
Right back there.
The situation in Europe today, what we've seen in the last few months, particularly with reference to the state of Israel, but certainly within France, for example, where Jews cannot walk safely in many places with a kippah on, a yarmulke. Are we seeing language and shades of the 1930s replicating itself in some fashion in Europe again?
No, yes. What do I mean? I was in, I'm a religious Jew. I was in Paris 8 weeks ago, 10 weeks ago, before the war. And I went to synagogue Shabbat morning, and I decided that I'm going to wear kippah in the street. Want to see what the response is. I write about anti-Semitism. What do? No problem. I was in Germany. I wore a kippah in the street. Now, if I'd gone through certain neighborhoods, I wouldn't have been able to wear a kippah. France is a unique position because France is now being radically secular. And therefore, you can't wear a burqa, but you also can't wear certain types of head covering. And they want Jews, for example, to wear hats, not yarmulkes, not because they object to yarmulkes, but because they don't want religious symbols in certain places. There was a debate in New York when I went to school in a New York day school, a Tony day school. We were taught that the yarmulke was an indoor garment. A gentleman wore a hat in the street. Very difficult to tell us that after John F. Kennedy was president, who destroyed the hat business in 30 seconds. But the idea is, can you manifest yourself and are you safe? I edited a book which is called Not Your Father's Anti-Semitism, which says if you fight the last battle, you're not prepared to fight the current battle. Anti-Semitism today is not the anti-Semitism of the 1930s. It's the anti-Semitism of 2014. That doesn't mean it's not a problem. Years ago, I was in a meeting of Jewish leadership. We'd come back from Ethiopia, and we reported that Jews were starving, they were dying, they were discriminated against, but there was no systematic killing. All of a sudden, everybody in the room took a deep breath and they said, okay, we can live with that. And we said, but you didn't hear us. We said Jews were dying, they were starving, they were discriminated against, they were facing persecution. Why does the Holocaust become the new threshold? Can't become the new threshold. This is not 1930. Look, Hitler in the end controlled 22 different countries. It was the policy of state in the lands that were controlled, dominated, and allied with Nazi Germany, with only few exceptions, to murder all of their Jews, men, women, and children. This was done with the power of state, with the instrumentalities of state, with the technologies of state. And the technologies of state means that essentially, I spoke about the Wannsee Conference. You know what happened at the Wannsee Conference, in essence? Genocide took on a new dimension. Before the Wannsee Conference, they were killing Jews one by one by one, bullet by bullet, town by town. They had mobile killers, stationary victims. After Wannsee, ordered before Wannsee, by the way, the death camps were open, in which they had systematic killing, and they made essentially the victims mobile and the killing centers stationary. So I worked on a camp called Belzhitz. 500,000 Jews were killed there between March and December 1942. The staff of Belzhitz was 104, of whom 14 were Germans and 90 were Ukrainians. They didn't need lots of people. If they organized it properly, it was a factory. It was Henry Ford and Charles Darwin united. We are facing something else. We may want to go into the Israel issue, but that's something else. We're facing something else. And Europe is seeing the Israel issue through the lens of colonialism in a post-colonialist era. It's also in this crazy situation where a generation ago they accused the Jews of going like sheep to the slaughter, and now they accuse the Jews of being disproportionately militant. Either way, they accuse the Jews, but different crimes. But Europe sees it within a colonialist element, and Israel has been unable for 47 years, 47 years, it's been unable to decide what it wants to do with territories. So it has no strategy. If you don't know what you want to achieve, you can't even build to what you achieve. It's torn in half between those who want to control the territories and therefore the population, and those who want to get rid of the territory and therefore have a separate population. And the Israelis have reached an impossible consensus. You want to do the demography, the polling of Israel. Israel's reached two consensuses. First consensus is that safety for the future Israel is only found in a two-state solution, but we can't trust a Palestinian state. So 2/3 of the Israeli Jews say two-state solution is the only policy that makes sense. And 2/3 of the Jews say, but you can't trust the Palestinians to form a state because it's going to take the form of Gaza. Therefore, you're in an impossible situation. And Europe then says, look, we've moved in Europe to a situation after a 100-year war between France and Germany. They share the same currency. They go across borders without whatever have you. Get into the 21st century. And the Israelis say, we live in a tougher neighborhood. And the Europeans say to themselves, well, how long a list of wars do you want me to establish to tell you that I live in a tough neighborhood? And they learned something else from the same event, which was World War II. So again, anti-Semitism is a problem. It's a 2014 problem, not a 1933 problem, not a 1938 problem, not a 1942. Let me add one more sentence, which is the parrot. It's going to take 2 sentences, but you don't trust me on sentences anymore. The power of Israel is its weakness, and the weakness of Israel is its power. Let me explain. We live in a world in which we usually think that justice is in the underdog. Jews are used to think of themselves as David. We're now seen as Goliath. We're now the overdog. We're never used to that. That's not our role in history. That's not what we understand to be. We don't understand what we've achieved, which is being empowered. And what's the other half? So that's the power of Israel is its weakness. What's the other half of it? The weakness of Israel is its power. Meaning that Israel itself will not exercise and cannot exercise the power that it has because of the values it maintains, despite whatever you say about violence here, violence there. There's a disproportionate power between Israel and its enemies. In normal situation, people under those circumstances would exercise the full power at their disposal. It can't. Can't for good moral reasons. And consequently, on the one hand, it's amassed massive power. On the other hand, it can't unleash the power it's amassed. And it's fighting without a clear vision of what it's going to achieve ultimately. And it's also fighting people who are neither afraid to die nor to have their population die. That creates a new circumstances that I don't know that we've ever had. The only comparable thing is, look, no democracy would have been able to conduct World War II the way Joseph Stalin conducted World War II. Soviet Union lost 25 million civilians. You live in America. Do you think any president of the United States could have lost 25 million Americans and not surrendered and not given up? Do you think we're that bastardly to our own population? Stalin was able to do that. In that sense, that's the type of enemy we have without the power of Stalin, but also they're willing to sacrifice their people. That's why, again, even as we prepare for battle, and Israelis are learning it, as Americans are learning it, how do you deal with asymmetrical warfare? How do you deal with populations that you have to deal with? And that's part of the situation we face today. Doesn't make it easier. In one sense, it was clearer how to fight then, but that's what we are today.
I'm going to, out of respect for everyone's busy lives, I'm going to wrap things up there. I want to say thank you again to Marianne Lubar, and thanks to everyone who came here for this late afternoon version of On the Issues. We greatly appreciate that. For those of you who are in the room, I'll mention a couple of upcoming events. Next Wednesday, September 17th, I believe, we will release the next Marquette Law School poll. And we'll be again talking about the governor's race and some major issues in the state. And then on the 18th, we'll have our regular 12:15 On the Issues program. Dr. Howard Fuller will be our guest. He's just written a new book called No Struggle, No Progress. So we hope that you can attend that. Having said that, I want to thank Dr. Michael Berenbaum again for his time today. It's a delight to have you here at Marquette Law School.